The night at the Suncrest Shell had a smell to it. Hot pavement, spilled motor oil, the thin, metallic tang of neon humming from the convenience store sign. Under the sodium lamps, the pumps looked like small islands, their plastic nozzles catching light like relics in a shrine. At 11:47 p.m., the station belonged to three things. A lanky teenager with a cigarette tapping ash into an empty coffee cup, a late-model sedan idling, while a woman on the phone argued with some about rent, and Elijah Mercer, who moved to the lot with the quiet, precise step of a man who'd once been trained to read rooms, to measure risk by breath and body. Elijah was not from the neighborhood. His suit had the faint sheen of a courtroom wardrobe rather than the battered armor of regular late-night customers. He'd stopped for coffee on his way home from the courthouse after a day that had left him exhausted in the way that satisfaction and sorrow both can leave a person exhausted. Two judges' calendars, one plea bargain that crumbled, a witness who broke and then pulled herself back together. He needed black coffee and a moment away from a marbled silence of the building that held the scales. He did not expect the white Chevrolet with blue stripe to roll into the lot like an answer to a prayer. The car's engine cut. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms polished, badges glinting. Officer Ramirez, young, taut, the kind of officer who believed in rules more than in nuance, kept his jaw tight as he walked toward the pumps. Officer Nolan, broader, clipped hair, that rare look in his face that was neither cruel nor particularly kind, flanked him. When they saw Elijah standing by the pump, the world narrowed a protocol. Men in uniform, a man in a suit, the low-level flicker of suspicion. Sir, Ramirez said, voice clip, we got a call about a disturbance. Elijah raised his hands, a polite, unthreatening half gesture. He explained, simply, that he'd been getting coffee, that no disturbance had taken place, that his phone had pinged with an assignment reminder he'd been double-checking. The teenager with the cigarette moved closer, curiosity pulling at him like gravity. The woman in the sedan watched through the rear-view mirror, like an audience to an unfolding scene. For a breath, the night seemed suspended between the small acts of life and the weight of an institutional mechanism about to turn. Then one of the officers saw Elijah's wallet photo ID, a judge's portrait, the stark government headshot that made him look older, more severe than in life, and the tone shifted. Elijah's name registered on a radio call, in a way Elijah did not anticipate. In the small world of a gas station, where every face is usually anonymous and every exchange small, the presence of a judge was anomaly, news. Ramirez asked for ID. Elijah produced it. The air smelled suddenly of ozone, the hum of the neon sign sharpening like a violin string. A call came to the radio, a call about a missing store clerk in a different part of town, an eyewitness description that didn't fit Elijah at all except in too tiny. Misleading points. Height and coat. The officers' palms tightened on their belts. We'll just take him in for identification. Nolan said, not maliciously, not theatrically, but with that institutional calm that makes power feel inevitable. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He felt his pulse in the arc of his wrist. He thought of the courthouse, of the people who trusted him to weigh evidence without haste. He thought, absurdly, of the teenager with a cigarette, and wondered whether anyone ever sees a whole of another person at a glance. Handcuffs click into place with the same mechanical certainty as a gavel hitting wood. Sound files into memory. The teenager filmed the scene on his cracked phone. The window woman lowered her glass and watched as if witnessing a small play where the ending wasn't yet written. And Elijah kept his hands open by a kind of inclination he'd trained himself into, hands visible, palms out, the unspoken message of a man who wanted to show he bore no weapon. The officers guided him to the cruiser, and he stood against his body and felt the cool metal against the back of his thighs, as if that contact made everything more real. When they mentioned the precinct, Elijah gave his address, his place of work, his LinkedIn-style biography, and the officers kept their neutral faces. He was taken in not because the facts fit, but because the convenience of a quick procedure had the momentum of inevitability. In the back of the cruiser, the local radio murmured an advertisement for late-night pizzas, life continuing like a witness out of frame. Elijah watched the station's lights recede and felt a strange, empty slide of time. One moment the courthouse's quiet dignity, the next the clang of a holding cell. When Elijah sat in a cramped interrogation room later, a fluorescent box that seemed to strip color from everything so only truth or falsehood would remain. The officer reading the report stammered between the lines of procedure and discomfort. Elijah answered, measured, folding his life into statements that would stand under scrutiny. The officers asked about prior arrests. He'd never been arrested in his life. They asked if he could step out to the cooler. He declined politely. The sergeant who eventually came in had seen too many nights and too many mistakes to hold an audience of outrage. He saw paperwork and schedule. With paperwork filling in the blanks, the officers realized their mistake. The witness had described a man who'd been taller, who'd worn a different coat, who'd had a lighter gait. An apology came, flat, corporate. Elijah accepted because the world is heavy, and apologies are fragile things. They rarely restore the past. He left with coffee thrown away into a garbage bin and the late-model sedan's taillights like two small red dots receding into the drizzle. He returned to the courthouse the next morning with his robe hung over his arm like a flag, unaware that the universe of small injustices had one more turn to twist. Dawn was the kind of light that makes marble look like memory. The courthouse, draped in a soft blue, rose from the city like a promise. Elijah Mercer moved across its threshold with the weight of ritual beneath his feet. He had been a public defender once, a prosecutor later, then appointed to the bench after many small defeats and 2 notable victories. His robe, when he hung it on the peg in his chambers, smelled faintly of that night's coffee and the disinfectant of municipal cells. He told himself the arrest would be a footnote, an anecdote for the lunchroom. He told himself this with the mechanical faith of someone who divides his life into case files and calendar blocks. But the bench would not be a place of small notes that day. It would become an arena where past and present collided. The docket read like the day had been organized by fate. Misdemeanor arraignments at 9, a domestic hearing at 10, and a special disciplinary hearing at noon that made no sense until his administrative assistant, Marla, pushed a slim brown envelope across his desk with the soft authority of someone who knows how gossip becomes fate. The envelope contained the allegation. 2 officers under internal review, a complaint filed by a gas station clerk about a disturbance, and a mistaken identification gone sideways. The clerk's initials, the date, the station, the dispatch logs, an assembly of small paper facts, but the list of officers named as respondents sent a small, physical thrill through Elijah's chest when he saw the names, Officer Nolan and Officer Ramirez. For a beat, he felt the past night's strange humiliation thread through his body. Not humiliation so much as the odd sensation of being treated like a variable in someone else's protocol. The hearing was internal. It would be administrative, procedural, and meant to weigh whether officer conduct matched departmental policy. Elijah's presiding would be perfunctory in every way, except that the defendant officers would look up to the man whose suit bore the faint scent of police station fluorescent light, and who, the day before, had been guided into a cruiser as if the badge's authority were gravity. He sat alone in chambers to breathe and to prepare notes that would make the hearing impartial. Judges are taught to make the scales blind. Elijah tried to set his face like marble and his heart like a lamp gone low. He told himself to rely on boxes of evidence. Footage, logs, witness statements. He would not let memory dictate law. By noon, the hearing room was a slow-motion theater. The gallery filled with people. A reporter from a local feed in the corner clutching a notebook, the gas station manager in an ill-fitting suit, the teenager with the cigarette now dressed for daylight and hovering at the far end like a ghost, and the 2 officers who entered with an institutional gait, their palms empty and their posture formal. Nolan's jaw was set. Ramirez looked like a younger version of the man who had that night been taught with rules. They sat before Elijah as if in a small, private ritual, paperwork stacked neatly between their hands like armor. When the clerk testified, his words were small and literal. Man had been present. There had been confusion. The officers had acted on a radio description that misaligned in key details. The clip from a gas station security camera was played. The black car in the frame, the brief ambiguous motion that could be read in 2 ways, the small human gestures that looked different depending on the angle. Elijah watched each pixel, like a juror decoding a confession. He watched the face caught in the frame and felt a peculiar twist of recognition. The man's profile, the posture, the arc of his hand. The video's resolution didn't show identity so much as motion, and motion is treacherous to judge. In the moments between testimonies, the officers' counsel argued about reasonable suspicion and probable cause, terms that lived in statute but breathed in human life. The defense lawyer used phrases like operational necessity, thin-sliced decision-making, things that seemed to stitch law around instinct. He spoke of call volume, of the night shift strain, of the realities of policing in a city that asks too much of a few men. The plaintiff's counsel painted the picture differently. The friction of bias, the currency of assumptions, the way a mismatched description becomes permission to detain. As the hearing progressed, Elijah felt his own memory of the prior evening resurfaced not as grievance, but as data, his stance, his visible hands, the way the officer's eyes flicked between him and the cruiser. In that inner ledger, he found no anger that would blind him. Instead, a raw curiosity. How could a system designed to protect also nullify? He thought of the country's long history of power misapplied, of headlines that compressed tragedies into bullet points. He thought of small rituals, a correction, a form sign that might, in aggregate, be the scaffolding of change. When the hour came to recess, Elijah stepped out of the hearing room and into the courthouse's wood-paneled corridor, its portraits looking down with the unblinking patience of the past. The city outside rustled with small lives, but inside he felt like an axis upon which a tiny, stubborn hinge had been placed. He told himself that his role was to listen and to do even-handedness with the austerity of a craftsman. He would weigh video against testimony, procedural norms against human impact. The lawyers prepared their closing. The sergeant reviewed his reports, and Elijah, alone for a moment, adjusted his robe at the collar as if it were armor to be donned before a small war. The fact that the two officers had once placed him in cuffed hands the prior night was not a secret to the room. It was an incidental irony that kept shifting in tone between poetic and perilous. He sat back down at the bench before the hearing resumed, ready to meet the small, monstrous thing that happens when private experience and public duty collide. The hearing resumed with a cadence that felt like an edited film sequence. Testimony, objection, film clip, cross-examination, with each beat punctuated by the courtroom's authority. The city prosecutor, a woman with hair braided like a rope of certainty, walked the panel of witnesses through the timeline with forensic patience. She had prepared to show that the officers did not follow departmental protocols for verifying identity and de-escalation, that they had allowed a dispatch description to operate as a warrant in itself. She played the sequence of radio traffic in which the dispatcher's hurried tone could be heard. The urgency in a voice often transmutes into permission for amplified action. The defense counsel argued that split-second decisions required a certain latitude. Officers have to make judgments in real time, under the stress of possible danger. The word split second repeated in the room like a small mantra for mercy. Elijah listened. He watched faces as if reading subtitles beneath flesh. Ramirez's eyes flicked away during cross-examination, small lines of concern etching at their corners. Nolan's jaw set, but his hands tapped an invisible metronome against his thigh. A moment in the testimony became a hinge for the session. The gas station's clerk recounted seeing Elijah hand the teenager $1 in a private exchange earlier that night. A neighborly act, he said, a moment of purchase and small kindness, as Elijah had given exact change and smiled. Someone in the gallery tittered, like a misaligned laugh. Legal counsel tensed. That small act, in the clerk's telling, had been misread as furtive behavior by the officers. An interchange with a young black man became, in the opposite corner of perception, a suspicious pattern. The prosecutor placed emphasis on how context gets lost when systems are allowed to substitute shorthand for humanity. She spoke slowly of how descriptions can be a pretext for escalation, if not tethered to confirmation. The defense countered by invoking the very real daily risk officers face. Stories of ambushes, of nights gone wrong. But the room contained only facts now, and facts must be held up to light without the loom of anecdote. Elijah felt a complex weave of feelings as he watched video and heard testimony. He remembered, as if replaying a fill within a film, his own small gestures from the night before, the tilt of his head when explaining who he was, the light in his voice when he said, "I'm a judge." He had expected that the commitment of his title would hold weight in the officer's eyes. Instead, it had become, in their procedural world, just another variable to check against radio calls. The realization stung less as a slight than as a revelation of how institutional processes can blind practitioners to the texture of a life. He saw himself, not as an exceptional man, but as an ordinary person whose robe and position made the situation more visible but didn't alter mechanics of how decisions are made. For that reason, his role on the bench felt suddenly more consequential. If one could be misread despite robes and manners, how many others won't even be looked at twice? He thought of the teenager who had filmed the encounter, whose footage shaped public stories in the age of immediate virality, and the clerk who had misremembered, not maliciously, but with a fragile memory of someone who saw the same city every night and stored small events in an imperfect ledger. When the closing arguments rolled, both sides pitched a moral tone of top law. The prosecutor asked Elijah to use the hearing to send a message that protocols must be followed and that training must prioritize de-escalation and verification over expediency. The defense lawyer asked for mercy for officers who do their jobs, who are tasked with protecting a city that is sometimes ungrateful and always demanding. In the quiet, Elijah placed his hands side by side on the bench, feeling the grain of the wood like the skin of public life. He thought of jurisprudence as an art, not merely the mechanical application of rule, but an interpretive act that must account for human fallibility and institutional momentum. His internal monologue, the one the bar and the robe quiet, mapped out the possible findings he could issue: admonishment, retraining, formal reprimand, suspension. Each outcome carried consequences not just for the officers, but for the department's culture and the community's trust. He weighed these as if measuring light through glass. He rendered his preliminary findings with an economy that surprised even him. The officers had not followed the recommended procedures for confirmatory identification and had escalated a routine investigation into an arrest without sufficient cause. He recommended mandatory retraining on bias recognition and de-escalation, and review of dispatch protocols to minimize vague descriptions that catalyze unnecessary detentions. He also recommended that the department work with community liaisons to rebuild trust. The room murmured. The clerk nodded. The defense counsel's face sharpened into a legal frown, and the officers exchanged looks like men who had been found wanting not because they were guilty of malice, but because the system had allowed them to act with insufficient checks. Elijah's decision did not feel like a dramatic justice scene where right is triumphed and wrong is punished. It felt procedural and precise, like a line drawn to correct a tilt. Later, he would draft his written opinion with the care of someone placing a stone in a foundation, aware that words and directives can shape the next iteration of action. But film thrives on reversals, and real life, even when ordered by statutes, has an appetite for irony. The afternoon after the hearing, a video clip surfaced online. A shaky cell phone recording from the night before that the teenager had posted to a social platform with a caption that framed the event in cinematic shorthand: "Judge cuffed at gas station. Daily madness." The clip had no audio long enough to capture context, but showed the cruiser, a man's silhouette, a flash of badge, and then the click of handcuffs. It burned through feeds with the velocity of a small urban wildfire. People who lived on outrage turned the clip into a narrative of institutional humiliation. The clip was accompanied by commentary threads that leapt to moral conclusions, as curated outrage tends to do. And within hours it had become the city's talk show fodder. Elijah watched the clip circulating with a strange, double-sided feeling, a private embarrassment made public, and a public conversation opening about police-citizen encounters that could become consequential. When Marla told him about the online traction, Elijah felt the rush of a man seeing a photograph of himself in an unflattering light. He could see the cyber audience appetite for clarity where there is only ambiguity. On the one hand, the clip catalyzed a necessary public debate. Citizens questioned how quickly an authority could detain a public official and then release him with apologies. On the other, the narrative stripped nuance from the encounter, flattening human complexity into headlines. Elijah understood both impulses. He had presided over cases where viral clips united citizens and policymakers around reform, and he'd also seen how snippets could poison a jury pool. He had to contend with the dual truth that his own presence in the story might both spur institutional introspection and be used as a spectacle in which the real systemic issues will be sidelined by sensationalism. The mayor's office called for a review of the city's policing practices. A local civic group proposed community forums. The police union bristled. offering statements that framed the episode as a human error corrected by protocol. The officers involved saw lawyers, union reps, and press requests, an avalanche of attention that made normal police work feel like theater. Elijah's calendar filled with interview requests. He declined most, stating that as a sitting judge, he could not engage in public commentary on matters that might come before him. He was careful. Judicial ethics, he knew, are a narrow channel. One step wrong and impartiality might be questioned. But he allowed a short, formal statement to be released acknowledging the incident and pleading for a calm and thorough review. The press seized on human drama. Judge, cuffed, then presides, a line that reads like a log line for a midnight movie. That evening, the local talk show host rang him for an interview. He declined with quiet firmness of someone who knows the optics of a bench and the perils of spectacle. The viral clip affected more than headlines. It saw the teenager become, overnight, a figure many wanted to meet, and it pulled the clerk into a media orbit he didn't ask for. Community forums filled with people who had their own stories, small humiliations, bigger injustices, and the police department, chastened by the department's oversight office, convened mandatory trainings and began drafting new guidelines. For all that, Elijah felt the story crawling through his life in an invasive, surreal way. When he walked down the courthouse steps, strangers pointed at him with phones and whispered or approached him to shake his hand with a surplus of gratitude. Others, vexed and suspicious, asked in demanding tones about the nature of the hearing and the meaning of retraining. He learned what it felt like to be a symbol, sometimes a bright torch, sometimes an awkward object that people wield to point at larger problems. That night, he met with the officers, not as a magistrate pronouncing judgment, but as a man seeking to translate outcomes into practice. Nolan and Ramirez sat across from him in a small conference room furnished with municipal austerity. No cameras, no gallery. They were not the public image of villains or saints. They were men who'd made decisions within a conveyor belt of procedure. The conversation was raw without being dramatic, the kind of talk that only happens when the public noise has been turned down. Nolan spoke about pressure and how 20 years on the force shapes a man's reflexes into first responder reactions. Ramirez, younger and less composed, admitted how fear can dress itself as certainty. Elijah listened. He suggested practical steps, ride-alongs with community liaisons, workshops where citizens and officers cooperated on scripts of de-escalation, and a recommitment to visible identity verification protocols. He insisted on clarity in dispatch descriptions, on better training in mental health response, and on community outreach to mend trust. The conversation wasn't a movie's catharsis. It was a slow work of a city attempting, haltingly, to be less broken. News cycles churned and memory of the exact details became malleable. Some described Elijah as a hero for making reforms. Others called his intervention symbolic rather than substantive. Meanwhile, the internal affairs investigation continued its procedural arc, producing a stack of documents thicker than any of the participants liked. The department rolled out the recommended retraining pilot program. Officers were paired with community members for joint workshops where they discussed scenarios and improvisation responses. They practiced how to ask clarifying questions and how to pause for confirmation rather than leap. The teen who had filmed the original clip was invited to a public town hall to speak about the power of citizen documentation. He spoke haltingly about the moment, about how, in a few seconds of video, a person's dignity could be stolen or restored. The clerk, too, was there, and he apologized on camera for errors in recollection, explaining that fatigue and stress can warp perception. The camera's lens kept recording settlements and apologies in ways that felt at once theatrical and necessary, like a rehearsal for better days. For Elijah, the aftermath altered his daily rhythm. He kept seeing the cassette of his own minor humiliation replay in his head, not as a wound to nurse, but as a lens through which to shape policy. This is the thing about public role. Your personal weather becomes a forecast for others. He pushed for actionable changes in the department's training regimen. His first proposal introduced clearer standards for when an officer could conduct a stop and what constituted adequate verification. The presence of a clear, corroborated dispatch detail, a visual confirmation of identity, and an internal pause to consider whether detainment was necessary. He proposed a public dashboard showing complaints and outcomes and a partnership program for ride-alongs that included community leaders and local clergy. These measures were not utopian. They aimed for incremental repair. He wrote memos late into nights, his lamp sputtering, drafting the legal scaffolding that would turn the hearing's adjudication into municipal practice. The reforms had early successes and early failures. In one pilot neighborhood, a tense exchange between a shop owner and a patrolling unit ended with both sides talking instead of escalating, the result of a script taught in a workshop. In another scenario, an officer's hesitation during a call led to criticism from colleagues for being overly cautious. Institutional culture is a slow inertia that resists change as often as it embraces it. Elijah understood this. The bench has little mystical power to remake the entire city's policing at a stroke. Change, he learned in his years behind the gavel, is a small, persistent thing. Paperwork signed, schedules adjusted, training hours added. He continued to push, to monitor outcomes, to demand transparency, to remind people that a single corrective hearing could not turn back decades, but could be the seed in fertile ground if tended. Personally, he found solace in small routines. He resumed his jogging route past the river at dawn, breathing in the city air that now smelled of possibility rather than the stale odor of accusation. He wrote an op-ed about the need for humane policing and clarity of dispatch. Not an explanation of the hearing, but a call for structural change. His op-ed struck a chord with civic groups and prompted an invitation to testify at a panel evaluating the city's public safety budget. These were small gratifications. The knowledge that one could yoke embarrassment into purpose, that private indignities could become the raw material for public good. Yet at night, he still found himself replaying the clack of handcuffs like a foreign rhythm. The sensation never left him, but it changed shape into a quieter fuel, a memory that moved him to do what men in his position are given the capacity to do. Translate a single wrong into the machinery of right. The community noticed, slowly, skeptically, but they noticed. Some credited Elijah as a catalyst. Others saw him as a prudent magistrate doing his job. The officers who'd been at the center of the storm returned to duty, with new training hours log-stamped into their files. There was grumbling in break rooms. There are always stories like that. But in coffee houses and barbershops, people told each other how a small procedural change had prevented an unnecessary stop. The teen who'd filmed the original clip became, in an odd inversion, an informal community journalist, trained in ethical recording and engagement. The station clerk got a raise, the result of community pressure, and an acknowledgement that the workers' well-being mattered in this equation. All these shifts felt partial and human. None was a panacea, but each was a pixel in a larger image. Step 6. As months passed, the story receded from front-page feeds, but continued to ripple in bureaucratic memos and in the habits of patrol units. Elijah's initial recommendations had been adopted into a broader departmental manual. Language about verification protocols, mandatory training hours, and an oversight review timeline. The city council convened a committee to evaluate the program's results, and Elijah was called to testify not as a celebrity, but as a practitioner who had seen a small fix make a marginal difference. He spoke carefully about institutional humility, the need for public institutions to admit error and to design mechanisms that make it harder for mistakes to ossify into patterns. "We are not here to humiliate people," he told the committee, "but to ensure that dignity is part of our procedural grammar." His words were measured and carried the weight of someone who sits in the middle of law and life. The officers learned something more intangible: how to listen not only for sounds that match a dispatch, but for the human rhythm in a crowd. Nolan, the more experienced of the two, began hosting small round-table conversations with neighborhood leaders. Ramirez volunteered to teach at a community center workshop for young men and women, discussing what policing looks like from inside and how citizens can interact safely with officers. These gestures were not dramatic reversals, but incremental bridges. The teenager who'd recorded the clip partnered with a nonprofit teaching others how to film ethically and use footage as a tool for civic improvement rather than spectacle. The gas station clerk, whose reputation had been knocked by the media storm, was offered a certification course in customer safety and mediation, a modest consolation and a practical uplift. Piecemeal, the city seeded lessons that could, in time, alter not just policy language but everyday practice. At home, Elijah found a new rhythm between robe and ordinary life. He hosted a small dinner for his neighbors, inviting people who had been part of the hearings, clerks, activists, a union rep, and the conversation was raw and human. They spoke of fear, of pride, of the ways public roles obscure private pain. He told them plainly that being a judge did not immunize him from being misread. It made him more, not less, determined to patch the seams of civic life. The dinner was not cathartic in the movie sense. No one leapt to a revelation, and all wept instantaneously. Instead, it was a slow, modest repair work of people willing to share stories around the table. The teenager apologized for sensationalizing the clip. The clerk accepted in a way that suggested a truce. A union rep conceded that internal review procedures needed tweaking. The officers attended without fanfare. They laughed at jokes that were not pointed, ate a modest cake, and left feeling like men less alone in the city, trying to be better. Life on the bench moved forward. Cases came and went. A custody hearing that required tenderness rather than law. A landlord-tenant dispute that demanded procedural clarity. A criminal case where an officer's adherence to protocol made the difference between guilt and reasonable doubt. Elijah found in each the same lesson. Law is a mechanism that must be constantly tuned to human fallibility. He felt strangely grateful for the humiliation at the gas station, not for its sting, but for the awareness it yielded. Humiliation, he thought as he reviewed motions late at night, can be a teacher if you allow it. It teaches you what you might otherwise ignore. Years from now, he imagined, this small incident might be a footnote in a long career. For now, it was a hinge, a tiny site where his personal and public lives intersected and demanded repair. On the evening, the city announced a formal partnership between the police department and several community organizations, an initiative inspired in part by the outcomes of Elijah's hearing. The weather turned soft with rain, as if the city itself had sighed. The event was modest. A press conference, a few speeches, and a gathering of community leaders, officers, and ordinary citizens. Elijah walked to the podium with the unfussy gait of a man who has seen storms and knows the work of tending calm. He spoke not to claim victory, but to argue for the labor of continued engagement. We cannot engineer justice in a single hearing, he told those gathered, but we can design institutions that are more resistant to error. The applause was polite but sincere. Officers Nolan and Ramirez stood off to the side, both with slightly eased faces. One had the tentative smile of a man learning to carry his badge as a symbol of service rather than power. The program's early metrics were promising. Fewer complaints in pilot zones, better satisfaction scores in community surveys, and a small uptick in police-citizen-mediated resolutions. These numbers were raw and provisional, and everyone knew they could fluctuate, but they represented something more than statistics. The possibility that a single procedural correction could shift lived experience. The team became a community liaison, teaching others how to document responsibly. The clerk ran a small safety training at his station, adding plexiglass arguments and a better lighting setup for late nights. The department instituted a transparency portal where citizens could view complaint procedures and track outcomes. None of this was radical. None promised utopia. But it was honest work that grows in small, cumulative steps rather than grand proclamations. Elijah returned to bench and resumed the daily, grounding work that defines a jurist. Listening, measuring, deciding. He knew there would be future cases where power would be misapplied and future headlines that would both exaggerate and simplify. He accepted the reality of imperfect systems that require constant tending. In private, he kept the photograph the teenager had taken the night of the arrest. It hung in a folder, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even people who sit on high of skin and can bruise. Once, months later, a child he counseled at a school outreach program asked him why he cared so much about small procedural changes. He told the child, honestly, that dignity is a fragile currency, and that when institutions protect it, they protect the lives of ordinary people. The child's eyes were bright and receptive, and Elijah felt the odd, stubborn warmth of hope. Years from that night at the gas station, the event would settle into civic memory as a story of modest reform sparked by a moment of misidentification. Film directors might fold it into archival footage for a documentary about policing in the early 21st century. Scholars might cite the case in discussions of administrative remedies and procedural design. For those who lived it, the memory would be less tidy. It would be a collection of small scenes, a clip on a phone, the clack of handcuffs, a courthouse hallway, a table with cake, stitched into a narrative that felt like both pain and possibility. Elijah sometimes walked past a Suncrest Shell on his morning run. He would pause, watch a new car fill at the pumps, and feel a quiet gratitude for the fact that the world had shifted little by little towards something more wary, more careful, and he hoped more humane. The end of that sentence in a film might show his face in close-up, a soft rain on the courthouse steps, and the slow retilting of scales that never settle entirely, but could be nudged toward balance, one small measure at a time.